Danielson Institute, which I'll probably say a little bit about as we go along. It's an institute that was started in the 50s by a couple that had a vision for integrating psychology and spirituality to help faith leaders understand about psychology and eventually to help mental health professionals understand about spirituality and religion. So our institute's on the campus of Boston University. We have a community mental health training clinic that is always specialized in spiritual, theological, existential issues from a pluralistic set of traditions. We have a training program for social workers, for psychologists, for couple and family therapists, and then we have a research center. So I wear a number of different hats. I'm a psychologist. I do mostly couple and family therapy. Throughout my career, I've worked with lots of faith leaders and other helping professionals, though that's not the only folks I work with. But I've seen a lot of what these issues can look like on the inside of couple and family relationships. We have what's been called a clergy in crisis program at Danielson. We've just relabeled it clergy wellness program to have a little broader, more encompassing vision. But that program does work with faith leaders who are struggling tremendously in various ways, as well as increasingly trying to do wellness, formation-based work. A lot of the research that I've been involved in throughout my career has been about the formation of faith leaders. About 23 years or so doing that work. My rock references the Peale family. I don't know if you're familiar with Norman Vincent Peale and Ruth Stafford Peale. They have a family foundation. They're no longer living, but Norman Vincent Peale was kind of a major religious figure in the 20th century. What he's a little bit lesser known for was right at the heels of the Great Depression, he had a church that was sort of taking off in Manhattan, and he partnered with a psychiatrist who had the great name, Smiley Blanton. Now, Smiley Blanton was actually analyzed by Freud. He was kind of a deep psychoanalyst, so I'm not sure Smiley really fit. But this minister and this psychoanalyst developed one of the first church-based counseling centers in the United States that's still got a presence in New York City. And it was quite a powerful historical influence at that point, as I said, heels of the Great Depression, to bring faith and mental health together. And their institute and their programming had a great run. They still have a clinic, but eventually some of the training died out. But the Peales have really gotten a vision for the importance of the mental health and well-being of pastors and other helping professionals. I'm sure we all know it's a tough time to be on the front lines. I think it's always been difficult to be in pastoral or any kind of ministry or mental health work. But I would say from my vantage point and from the research we've done, it's really a crisis time, I would say, around those issues. So I'm looking forward to these 2 days. My plan is very permeable to what you all want to get into. I've got plenty of stuff to talk about, but I assume you all have particular things you want to engage in and dialogue about. So I will be very glad to go with the things that are most of interest to you. This morning I was planning that we would get into, as you saw the abstracts I sent out, to discuss trauma, suffering, and flourishing among faith leaders, some research, practice stuff we're doing, kind of laying out what are the challenges and talking together about that. Then after the break, pivoting to talk about our chrysalis formation program, which is just one intervention response, but I think that we can engage in that in a way to kind of consider what are the variety of ways we can try to address these issues. And I can share what we're learning from our context, but we can talk together about that. Then tomorrow morning, I planned for us to do humility in an age of narcissism. I heard some narcissism discussion on the Zoom conversation that I was sent that you all had. That is a big area of work that we also do, kind of refashioning what humility is about, how that can be a protective and formative virtue if rightly understood. It can be actually a toxic thing if wrongly understood in oppressive contexts. Narcissism is, I think, a really important and interesting topic. So we'll unpack that in the morning. And then I had in mind to finish up with our relational spirituality model of formation to kind of wrap around how do we at Danielson think about spiritual formation from a relational perspective that can address both the challenges of suffering and the invitation to growth. So that's what I've got marked up for the plan. Any inputs about stuff you want to be sure that we try to get to before we dive in? And it means that, well, I'll share some data, but when I look at the trauma risks for folks on the front lines of helping others right now, which in our data are most serious among faith leaders, we're working with chaplains, mental health professionals, and clergy, basically. And the trauma rates among faith leaders is, I think, staggering right now. It's higher than it is for chaplains and for mental health professionals. Actually, my own background was I went to seminary trying to decide if I was going to be a pastor or a psychologist, and I chose the easier path of becoming a psychologist, which is now borne out in the data, which is that it's a particularly vulnerable time for faith leaders. And I say crisis because I think it's unsustainable. I don't think it's sustainable. I think that the approaches that we're taking to the preparation of faith leaders are not, I'm speaking broadly now, are on the whole not considering the combat level risks that faith leaders are up against. And so I think if we look at the impact, the symptom levels, it's just not sustainable. I think I'm working with some groups that are really concerned that they can't recruit people to the front lines. I'm using military metaphors quite intentionally. If you read some of our stuff, you will have heard one of my talking points is I think the military is actually doing more to prepare soldiers for the realities of combat and trauma than most of our faith traditions are doing for faith leaders. When I look at the landscape of seminary preparation and what I see happening, there's just a huge gulf. And I know some religious groups are worried that if we're really, candid with people about what's needed to be on the front lines, people won't sign up, right? So that's a real challenge. It invites ethical considerations, though, doesn't it? Does it not? I mean, I work at a theological seminary, so my paycheck is coming from a place that's, taking people in who are aspiring for frontline work. But I don't know that we're always straight about what's going to be necessary to succeed at that formatively. So let me unpack a little of this, and then we'll see what you all think about it. Gratitude to a bunch of funders of this work over the years. I mentioned the Peel Foundation, but several others, including Lilly, funded one of our early projects. We have a large team working especially on our Peel project. It's mostly what I'm going to focus on, so I want to give a shout out to them. And I invited you to think about your intention for this time together. I hope you've had a chance to think about that. And that would help me to even hear one or two of you briefly, what feels like the important thing for you about what we're looking into here. Yeah.
My program is working with first call pastors, and I'm looking for concrete ways to preemptively prepare pastors so that they have the healthiest starts in ministry to keep them from falling apart, burning out, being traumatized, or whatever language you want to put on it, in order that they either have a really messy career or leave the ministry.
Yeah, great. That's exactly what we're trying to do. Great. Maybe one other?
I was confessing a little earlier to Gary that, I've been in ministry for some 30 years or so, and I'm just now trying to figure out how mental health, right, and the psychological disciplines and the missing.
Yeah.
So it feels like a confession because it feels a little bit like malpractice at some level as we think about discipleship. And so I don't know what I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very interested in
Yeah, great,
hearing what you have to say.
great. And confession's a good spiritual practice, right? So, yeah, thank you. Well, you already did courageous conversations. I was going to note some principles for our time together, but I was glad that to hear that you have done this work on the backboard. Let's look these over and see if there's anything unique here that you didn't get to. One trauma-informed principle that I think is really important is that we really do respect one another's unique experiences, and also that we realize that we're getting into topics that can be challenging to our physiology, to our spirits, to our bodies. And so I like to invite everyone to do what you need to do as we get into this. If you need to get up and move around, stretch a bit, take a break, let me know how it's going as we go along as well. Dan Aylshire, who was former leader of the Association of Theological Schools, published a book a couple years ago, really noting the shifting landscape of faith leadership in North America, the US, and suggesting that really with reduced religious participation and declining social trust of leaders, it really is a different landscape from what it used to be. And one of Aylshire's implications is that the formation of leaders can't rest on an earlier paradigm of developing really sound theological knowledge. It can't really rest even on developing excellent professional leadership skills. His argument is that we really have to emphasize the formation of spiritual and relational maturity if faith communities have a chance in the current landscape. And I would just draw out if faith leaders have a chance. That, as I said, I do think there's a number of factors sort of conspiring at this time to make it more and more stressful to occupy these positions. And so it's within Aylshire's call that we're doing a lot of our work at Danielson. So let's talk about some terms that get thrown around a lot. Burnout is one. I'm sure a lot of you are paying attention to the burnout risks and what's involved in that. A common definition includes emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, which could be looked at as kind of a coping strategy. Once exhaustion sets in, I'm going to make work feel less important to me. And then a declining sense of accomplishment in one's work. Those are the three hallmark elements of burnout. They kind of build off of each other. I'm sometimes working with faith leaders or therapists who I'm pretty sure are exaggerating their lack of accomplishment because they now subjectively feel so bad and in some ways want to get distance from the work.
Can you say this again? You said emotional exhaustion. What were the other two?
Yeah, it's in this top quote. Emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and a reduced sense of personal accomplishment. So this quote here is from one participant in our research, a faith leader. How draining it is to always feel needed, that having 150 bosses is exhausting and complicated, that pastoral ministry is not at all what it was 20, 30, 40 years ago, that the expectation that church people have on pastors is absurd.
Amen.
Why do you say amen? What do you?
All of that.
Yeah.
I just think it's interesting that there's we're in some turnover within our team, and we keep trying to help people recognize, like just coming out with a master's degree, an MDiv, for example, which is very common in our particular community, doesn't prepare you for
Yeah.
the things that you're about to experience and the expectations and the transference and all of the things that happen with pastors.
Mm-hmm.
That's just funny to think 150 bosses are so true.
other reflections on this quote.
I think we were talking about this at dinner a little bit last night, but there are all these people to care for, and to be in these really beautiful and brutal spaces, and then to have no one else really to be able, on a peer level, to share
Right.
those with. And so you're just carrying it and carrying it. I was also struck by the latest Barna research that came out about pastors and mental health, and how many think it's important, the small percentage of those who are actually willing to seek it for whatever reasons.
Mhm.
So there's something in that that plays into this quote for me as well.
Do you have a hunch what it is that plays into that?
Excuse me?
Do you have a hunch about what it might be that plays into that?
I think some of it is, I would imagine, is, not, like thinking it's a failure. I also think some of it is, like the town I live in is not large, I mean, it's not small, but finding somebody that I can trust.
Yeah.
That also isn't connected to, I mean, I
Right.
know they're supposed to have an oath, but I don't know, it gets a little,
Yeah.
it gets a little scary about who I can trust and what I can trust as well.
Right. Right. Yeah. When we get to talking about our chrysalis program later, faith leaders have the most significant empirical effect in the program, and they're far and away the hardest to recruit into it. So chaplains, therapists, signing up hand over fist. It's harder to get faith leaders to participate. We'll talk about that.
See, in my case, as a person in recovery, in many ways, I think that the church was something that adds something to my process of burnout. But in the process of healing, I just find out that I never deal with my past and my childhood and all
Well.
the things. But my first reaction was to point church
Uh-huh.
until what you said in your story and with
Yeah.
help.
Right.
I just found out that I was hiding all the time,
Hmm.
using my faith.
Yeah. Yeah. Great point. What I want to build towards is we do need a kind of multidimensional framework for these issues, because there isn't a single factor that is causing these effects. We could be pastoring a pretty unreasonable group of people, unfortunately. Many of us bring in historical factors that may have been part of our movement towards these leadership positions. I sometimes like to say, hi, I'm Steve. I'm a recovering rescuer. I'm going to guess I'm not the only recovering rescuer in this room, but you don't have to out yourself if you don't want to. Got a sense of call to ministry during a family crisis and in adolescence. So there's deep roots to that pull towards overfunctioning, towards going well beyond what my capacities are. How many folks are getting an opportunity to reflect on that? And then there's wider systemic factors that are influencing these experiences. Racism, sexism, economic issues. So we're going to need to attend to those different dimensions. Gary?
Just from our own little work, I just kept remembering, I think it was Arch Hart, and Arch talking about the 50 hats that a pastor wears.
Yeah.
Of course, no one's equipped to wear those hats. And so, but the mismatch between the three or four life-giving hats a pastor would like to be wearing,
Yeah.
and the hats that they would expect to be wearing, being the life-taking category, seem to be the most common.
Yeah, right.
From this group for burnout.
Yeah. Too many roles and it pulls away from those
The
schools.
mismatch between what I thrive in doing versus what I'm expected to do.
If you took a look at the article I sent around, I love this work, but it's killing me, that brief article. We cite Rick Deshawn's work, who did a really sophisticated organizational behavior person, did a sophisticated analysis of faith leader roles within the United Methodist Church, and published it. Said that they generated 64 different competencies that pastors needed for that job. And what was striking is Deshawn also said he had actually never seen a job like that. In all his work with various industries, he had never seen such a complex job. And he asked the question, who would try to do this? You know, I mean, it was a powerful statement about, it's not even a joke, 50 different hats. There's sound research to show it. Okay. Also, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Dan White's pastor burnout story. Have any of you heard? Oh, okay. Yeah, I need to send that around. Dan White was a pastor who has a very powerful story that has gotten picked up by a lot of folks. He actually ended up in the doctor's office, thought he had a neurological problem. And it turned out they ended up diagnosing him with PTSD related to just the intense socio-political struggles early in the pandemic, the tremendous set of hassles, you know, dealing with public health measures, the conflict and tension within his congregation. He was shocked. He didn't know that that's what the symptoms were. He's now gone on to develop some ministry to try to help pastors to deal with this. So some of the education around trauma risks for faith leaders that I think is important is to understand the risks of secondary traumatic stress, which is defined here, stress reaction based on exposure to traumatic material. Any of these roles, faith leader, therapist, chaplain, are going to involve chronic exposure to traumatic material. And that can eventually begin to have an effect if we don't find good ways to metabolize that, to get support, to place some limits and boundaries around it. It just isn't going to work. Vicarious traumatization really references the fact that our empathic or compassionate abilities in some of these fields actually increase some of the risk. Now, that's just something that's going to have to be managed because compassion and empathy are so important. But some folks aren't really getting enough help on how to manage those sorts of risks. One of the best therapists I ever studied under was a trauma expert. She taught me a good bit of the time when you're going into someone's traumatic material, call on your own experience to be able to empathize. Try to call on something that's somewhat similar. Because if all you do is only enter into their experience, you will burn out. It was really kind of a paradoxical idea. It would seem like getting more and more into their experience would be crucial, and there's an element in which it is. But it was really good wisdom. So some of this research, I think a few of you have heard us talk about from our group. What do we mean by trauma? Trauma, I'm a little concerned about kind of the overexpansive use of the term these days. I think that's one thing we could talk about. I do think trauma can be a common experience, but some folks are overusing it. Some real trauma survivors find that stressful to have it bandied around. What do I mean by trauma? Embodied existential dynamics of overwhelming levels of threat and anxiety that overwhelm our ability to process. And trauma is always existential. It always taps into existential issues about our human vulnerabilities, which is how it turns very spiritual as well in ways that are difficult. So we have a variety of responses to trauma. Fight, flight, freeze, fawning responses are some of the common ones. It's valuable for people to know their default mode. Church leadership teams, couples that have very different trigger responses to trauma can have tremendous conflict over not understanding those differences. The good news is there's a number of good empirically supported psychotherapies for PTSD level trauma, so we're in a good place with that, although access to those treatments is not universal, obviously. I got started with this because at Danielson, they had done when I arrived there a number of years ago, they had a data set with a bunch of measures on clergy from a particular religious group I won't name. And there was the leading PTSD measure was in the data set. And so they asked me to take a look at this. I'm going through. And I realized about a third of these faith leaders were scoring at the clinical level of PTSD symptoms. which I referenced against post-deployment military personnel and realized that the average trauma level was higher for these faith leaders than for military personnel using the same measure. And when we raised that with this particular religious group, they shut it down and said they didn't want that published or discussed because it would impede recruitment.
Steve, just a quick question. When you're talking military, you're talking people who are exposed to battle?
Yeah,
Yeah, okay.
yeah.
But the military might have a higher number that aren't on the front lines.
Right, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, post-deployment, yeah. So, yeah. So we also had a lot of qualitative data about the situation, and these faith leaders were asked to write about their experiences in ministry, and we had a lot of qualitative data about the different situations that were activating that level of stress. So we replicated the study with faith leaders from Christian, Jewish, and Muslim traditions, a more diverse sample, and we found basically the same results, and published that. Libby Ruffing from our group published that in 2021. About a third were in the PTSD range. With those measures, if you look at kind of the clinical concern range, not sort of clearly at that level, it was over 50% were at the clinically concerning level. One thing that stood out in both of those data sets in the qualitative data was the levels of relational aggression. You all know about this stuff, but some people are surprised at the level of outright meanness or cruelty coming from within the camp, right? That's part of Dan White's story too. That stood out. That wasn't the only thing. You can get a lot of exposure to death and loss. You can get faith leaders invited into situations I would never be in as a psychologist. If someone dies by suicide, I'm never going to get called over to the family's house, right? So many of us who are mental health professionals have layers of protection of exposure that faith leaders don't get in the sort of direct exposure. And the unpredictable nature of it, right? When is this stuff happening? Yeah.
So I assume that this isn't just the present day, or even, the ministry experience, but this would also, did this study acknowledge the stories that people are bringing in, which I already heard you kind of acknowledge, like their own formational stories as well, like why they even chose to do ministry, because people have trauma in their own family origin story. Right?
Sure,
So
sure.
did that study even look at, or were they just kind of pretending, not pretending, but were they just addressing the present day kind of ministry experiences that we all are having?
Yeah, that's a great question.
I
So,
feel like that's like a major thing to acknowledge, because we all know that trauma can, once it gets unearthed, all of a sudden you're like, oh my goodness,
yeah.
there's some stuff that I haven't explored yet, or I'm aware of that part of my story that's extra tender, that
Right.
I'm bringing into this present day.
Right, yeah, great points. We'll unpack those. So this study was not, you definitely could have had some of these leaders who brought trauma histories into this work, and the research was focused on their experiences in ministry. So no doubt, some of the historical influence on that is from previous. It still means there's a high baseline level of vulnerability here. In fact, if I could just jump down to Dr. Eric Brown, who's a researcher at Boston University Medical School who's working on our team, has published a study recently with Black clergy and with another one with Black mental health professionals. And Eric's looking at the ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences that maybe some of you have heard about, the historical factors that increase risk for trauma. And Eric's research shows in a large national match sample that among Black clergy, their level of historical trauma influence is higher than the average Black adult person who's not clergy. So that actually invites questions even more broadly than just the Black community. Is it possible that some of us are drawn to the front lines of this work, sometimes because of trauma histories, right? And what kinds of vulnerabilities do we need to prepare for in light of that, is I think the question that follows from that. So Eric's great study also shows, which is publicly available. Anything you all want more information about, just let me know, keep track. If this is stuff from our lab, I can just send it to you. This study is actually publicly available. Eric also found that, kind of the good news, that trauma risks were buffered by certain religious coping, certain spiritual practices that were constructive, that would be like the one we opened with today that had a positive theme of love and acceptance, that buffered those trauma risks, as well as congregational support when congregations were emotionally supportive of their leaders, which we know doesn't always happen, right? So there are things that can buffer these effects, but it does suggest that there could be a benefit in those of us going into these roles to have some opportunity to unpack what you're suggesting. And our research with seminary students right now is showing that many coming in the door, we've been doing research with first-year seminary students, are able to name certain vulnerabilities that they're bringing into the work. Already, first semester of seminary. I know I have a tendency towards perfectionism, towards over-functioning, towards low self-esteem, towards narcissism. I was pleasantly surprised some folks acknowledge their own narcissism. Not always, serious narcissists, not always easy to get them to acknowledge. But my point is, I was impressed that students coming in the door know they have some vulnerabilities. I think the data suggests they don't, on average, have an idea of the level of trauma risk that we're talking about here, and those of you who are more seasoned know that. But the question then again becomes, are they getting a chance to actually formatively deal with those vulnerabilities or not? And I think there's some places that have good programs to try to help address that, and other places are blowing it off.
I find this really interesting. For almost, I guess now 10 years, I've been in a weekly covenant prayer with an African-American pastor and another pastor. And we have listened for 10 years as he has become aware, he's 60-something now, of this horrible, traumatic early life. He's going through therapy, and God is healing, but it has been a slow process of caring. And we were saying over and over, do we use the word love? God loves you. I mean, to listen to him, he said, I remember being beaten so much that blood runs down my legs. 4-year-old. So very fascinating that black pastors have experienced trauma more than other black men. That is really interesting. And this guy has tried to rescue everybody, and he's done it successfully. With millions, lots of people. I said millions, that's too many, but
I think it's, I interpret it, and Eric's leading conversations with Black faith leaders in the Boston area as part of this project. This is in every community. I think those who are drawn to helping others often have a tremendous compassion that's born out of suffering. And I'm concerned that in too many of our communities we've been naive about how that plays out. Or the levels of relational support, invitations to growth that are needed to actually harness those capacities for compassion and care over the long haul. Yeah.
I'm interested in what you were just a quick, this is a sidebar, what you were saying about some pastors who've experienced trauma, and perhaps the church is the place, maybe it is that place it is. I'm interpreting this as
Yeah, go ahead.
the church was this space that helped them navigate that, and so maybe that's why they call it ministry. A lot of my work has been with folks where the church was the place that caused the trauma. And I'm curious if there's been any kind of research about, I don't even know how you would do this, but about what kind of church or what kind of community is the one that nourishes versus the one that shames or causes what were some of the perspectives or the language or the theology?
Mhm.
Kind of work on that.
I really don't think there's been enough sort of social science quality research on that. The areas of spiritual and religious trauma are growing, but still the research is kind of thin. And you're also asking a more advanced question too, which is, I take it, what kind of communities would support healing and growth, right? And I'm hoping that we'll be meditating on that through, some of our thoughts about it, but you all will have thoughts too about what healthy relational spirituality is like and needed. And it's, the courageous conversation commitments are a set of the kinds of things, but other relational development capacities are really necessary to do better than that. So we did a national study of clergy and chaplains over the previous year and a half or so, using a lot of these same measures. We found that the percentage scoring in the clinical range for PTSD jumped to about 41%. Over half the sample was in the clinical concerning range. Clergy had higher trauma rates than chaplains and therapists. Here's another thing that is kind of concerning, but it sets the stage for what we're doing. The team that you saw, we've been doing systematic literature reviews. We do research as part of our pathway to practice. I sent you that. Kristen Heidegger took the lead on that review of burnout, trauma, and well-being among clergy and chaplains. Here's one of the Cliff Note pieces. There's, I think our team started with like 560 studies and whittled it down through some rigorous quality criteria to 82 studies that met high quality research standards. But they looked over hundreds of studies. There were 4 that tested any kind of intervention for burnout or trauma or well-being among faith leaders. That's 4 studies that tested anything like trying to do something about it, right? The rest were all pretty much documenting the problem. I was with a group of bishops recently, and I went in this, and one of them got really angry. Like, what do you mean? We're just getting these problems documented over and over again? And no one is actually trying to test that something actually works, right? That's what our Chrysalis program is trying to do. There's folks at Duke that are testing some good projects. But really what that means, and actually it's no better for mental health professionals, is I'm here to tell you that we really don't know what can prevent burnout or vicarious trauma or promote well-being among any of these fields over time. We don't know. I mean, we're doing research to try to fill in the gap, but I think it's kind of sobering that at a research level, we don't know. It's hard to do this kind of research. My rock is about the Peel Foundation because they gave us $2 million to actually try to figure this out. It's hard to get funding for this kind of thing. And there's a lot of scales at which we could try to responsibly try intervention programs and see what their effects are, but we need more of that. Tell me your name again, Daniela? Yeah. Did you have your hand up?
I don't.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
I'm Jessica.
Yeah, Jessica.
So when I look at these studies and I think about them, and I look back at what you said earlier, like about, sort of living in a unique cultural time
Mm-hmm.
where we have just survived a pandemic.
Right.
We have dwindling congregational numbers.
Mm-hmm.
We have changes in the way that people understand ministers' credibility in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And we have, 2 decades now of church infractions that are constantly in the news.
Right.
And I can look at those and say, yeah, that feels like it would potentially lead to burnout and trauma situations.
Mm-hmm.
But then I wonder, how unique are we really from people who were serving in ministry 40, 60, or 100 years ago? Or 700 years ago when people were burying 40 people a day during the Black Death?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so I wonder if you could speak a little bit to how we understand ourselves in this place in a unique way over and above other clergy. Because the pushback I have in my own brain when I think about this is people have been doing this for 2,000 years. and you're not getting thrown into a pit with a lion, Jessica,
Mm.
right? So.
It could be worse, in other words.
Yeah. I don't wanna, yeah, maybe that's how I want to think about it. But
Right.
can you speak to that a little bit, like what that disparity or duality looks like?
Well, let's work it as a group. I think it's a great question. What do you all think about this? This question, could it have been worse in the past? What would that mean to any of us who are doing this kind of work if it was worse in the past?
I find myself wondering if the question is actually what do we need to learn from their perseverance in the past.
Hmm.
Certainly was in the church in the first century.
Gary, your rich appreciation for the history of spiritual formation could help us out here in terms of what folks were needing to do in those difficult times.
That's about all I had.
Okay. Other thoughts about this?
I also wonder about like how the mind works is like it doesn't matter if it's like literally worse or not. It matters how your mind and your emotion are experiencing whatever you're going through, because it's decontextualized trauma.
Yeah.
Where like
Mm-hmm.
you know you watch the film and your heart is racing and you're freaking out, even though you're just watching the film and the monster's not actually coming to eat you, but your body's reacting as if it is.
Uh-huh.
Right? Like that lion is not chasing you anymore, but we can have a conversation with someone and our bodies can respond as if there's a lion in the room with us.
Mhm.
Right? So
Yeah.
I think it's like, how are we creating this space to adapt and cope and
Mhm.
find those relational supports to navigate whatever the experience is.
Mm-hmm.
Because we all experience things differently.
Mm-hmm.
You know, even looking at different families, like they can have twins who go through the exact same experiences, and one kid could be really traumatized, and one kid could
Yeah.
be really well adapted. And so, how are we creating a space to learn
Mm-hmm.
about our bodies and community, and how we can
Mhm.
cope with these experiences that we're having? That's kind of where my wondering goes.
Gary?
Oh, but that seems very fair. Yeah, but in contrast to the church the first, I mean, I'm probably too much of a fan of the church the first few centuries, but there also seemed to be more of a sense that this actually works.
Mm-hmm.
This actually pathway to radical, different way to live, of experiencing love and peace and joy,
Mhm.
and you know, and the miraculous. There's just the hope that wait, it actually worked then.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a little bit different now. There's a little bit less of a sense that this might actually produce a radically different form of life as opposed to
Mm-hmm.
just keeping the system going.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was going to reflect the same thing. I don't know that the same so the quote earlier, the expectations that the 150 parishioners would have are being absurd. I don't know how much of that sat inside the first 2 centuries. So it feels like some of the expectations came out of, if we would call it Christendom, right? And one of the things that would be different then would be the establishment of those expectations. And now with this greater suspicion, right? And less grace and perhaps belief that my pastor is the more holy person that and can't handle
Mm-hmm.
that they're broken people as well. Some of those things seem to sit inside this space, the tolerance to give room. And many of us still hold to those absurd expectations.
Mm.
So,
As clergy, we do?
as clergy.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think going back to the scriptures is like the most essential thing in that question, right? Because we see Paul like write consistently about the challenge of being a leader. So I mean, we can see this in the very, very beginning of the church. I've been sitting in my first and second Corinthians, and like, yeah, it's just full of Paul saying it's going to be hard. You'll be squeezed, you'll be pressed, like your body will give out. Like it's about the inner transformation that happens. So I mean, that was happening from the very beginning of time, no matter what. And I think I would hope that it would need, over the centuries, that it would need that validation. Because I think that's a little bit of what you're saying. I don't know. I mean, but I mean, there's a validating of like this is just hard as leaders. I mean, we've taken on a calling and a job that is just hard, right? Now,
Mhm.
the thing that I'm wondering in more recent time is, and I'm glad we're talking about the cultural context of what's happening, because I do think we have to get out of the water every so often and recognize that we're sitting in a think is killing us, right?
Mhm.
So that kind of I mean, maybe it is an expectation, or maybe it's just something that's being put on us, that we have to do everything ourselves,
Mhm.
or that we can't trust other human beings, or that other people can't help us in the way that we need to be helped, or whatever those lies that are coming at us, right? In a culture that believes that we need to be able to be separate rather than we're better together. Right?
Mhm.
So, I mean, that to me is one of the fiercest things to be able to address, I think, in this conversation. So even the question that you're asking, which I think about like a lot, like how was this different in the 1800s? Like is it different? You know, and I just would wonder if having a more robust conversation, which is what we're having right now, on the cultural things that are coming at us in the midst of, from the beginning of time, this is just hard.
Mhm.
Does that make sense? Like this is just hard.
Yeah,
But
right.
the scriptures are full of the acknowledgement of that and the way that the Lord wants to talk to us in that. We have it in front of us. Does that
Mhm.
make sense? Like
Yeah.
we have it in front of us at the same time of acknowledging the uniqueness of what's happening in this type of
Mhm.
Western kind of context.
Right. Yeah, several things there that I just want to underscore. And the United States is the most individualistic country in the world by social science data. I don't think individualism is all bad. It's a set of cultural values, but we are the most individualistic country in the world. And most of the recommendations I'm going to make are towards relational development, community, the need for healthy, I mean, community isn't always great, right? We had a great conversation in seminary class the other day. Students were spouting off about community as the answer to everything. But like community can really suck sometimes too. It's healthy relational community that has this kind of stuff to it, right? That's important. And it could be that faith leadership was worse in the past. We don't really have data on that. I'm kind of pragmatic in the sense that I look at the landscape and the data now and I say, I don't know if it was worse in the past, but it's concerning right now. And I'm far from hopeless. I think there are things that we can do and work at, but it's going to take a little more seriousness about this and a little bit more wider recognition. And when I'm not talking to faith leaders, and I'm just talking to people in the other settings I travel in as a psychologist or professor or whatever, people are often surprised. Wait, if they're not part of faith communities, they don't understand what we're talking about. So I get people like, you're working on this thing to help trauma among faith leaders? What could be so bad about that? So there's also kind of a sense that sometimes people don't really understand, and that can limit resources and availability. Yeah.
I'm curious the difference, the pre-COVID numbers, you said a third of people were reporting trauma symptoms, so that's jumped from 33-ish to 40.
PTSD level.
PTSD level.
Yeah.
Okay. And then 50% to 57. That reflects the pre versus post-COVID or in COVID.
It's a little higher post-COVID.
Yeah. That's actually less of a jump than I would have expected. So I'm curious, the 2023, I mean, I guess, is there current studies that even would trend higher in 2024?
I haven't seen anybody who's assessing that right now. I think if we'd have done 2021, it probably would have been higher. In fact, the earlier side of the data was higher, and then it sort of started to, yeah. Now, the good news here, too, is, oh, yeah, go ahead.
Maybe this is meaningful. My family history is, I'm a retired military chaplain. My dad served also. So in World War II and Korean conflict, he wrote home every day, and my mother kept all those letters.
Mm.
The Korean conflict, 120 straight days, his unit was in warfare.
Oh, wow.
And I read these things now. My dad finished well, went through all of that, and I wonder, how in the world, because I read, every night he and the commanding officer would sit and go through the list of who was injured and who had died, and would cry over them and write letters to their families.
Right.
And then until the commander himself was injured, and Dad writes about watching the ambulance pull away with Colonel Adams, that was his name.
Yeah.
One letter he wrote about another chaplain that ended up crawled up in fetal position in the tent. Could not function. There was no condemnation in that letter. It just, this is where he is.
Mm-hmm.
26 years, and I was not in that environment, which is kind of, how did that happen? But it's that ongoing history of, I've got it right in front of me, of how a person.
The writing may have actually been helpful. I mean, when you look at what we know from research that helps with trauma, you know, I mean, maybe if we would all be writing about our stressful experiences in ministry and working with people these days, right? As well as the other kind of processing, that would be helpful.
Or like I noted, talking and praying with somebody in that.
Exactly.
When I think about what's different, I think about, Jesus had 12 disciples. We have.
When we get later, I'll predict that when we get later and I describe the chrysalis formation program we're doing that's showing empirical effects for burnout, vicarious trauma, and well-being, most of you, I hope you find the model interesting. I hope it's intriguing. Most of you are going to think, wait, that's not rocket science. They're like putting people into groups to process what's happening and support each other. I mean, I think it's a little more, humor me when we get there. I think it's a little more interesting than that. But like, a lot of these folks who are enrolling in this free program don't have any place else to do this. Many of you probably do have those things set up, and that's great. There's a lot of ways to work this stuff out. But it's kind of striking how many people are getting isolated, not slowing down, not writing letters about the traumatic. They're just on to the next thing, right? So let me give you a little bit of good news, because the next slide is going to deepen us into suffering. So I'll give you a heads up that we're going to look at some difficult stuff in the next slide of traumatic material. One of the good news things is in this study, and we'll unpack some of these in the coming sessions, there's a bunch of protective factors that are buffering these trauma effects. So that's, we're committed to a kind of positive psychology and a kind of negative psychology in our lab. We want to understand suffering, and we want to understand factors that can make a difference. I don't know if this is interesting to you, but as a research nerd, it's actually difficult in these kind of statistical models to get a whole bunch of different factors to still relate to the outcomes, because normally they would eat up the variance of each other. So I'm really excited that there's a bunch of different places we could try to develop interventions. We need more supportive management of folks in these roles. Self-compassion, we'll talk about that a little bit later. Faith leaders especially tend to be very compassionate of others and have a hard time practicing compassion towards themselves. You may be well aware of this. It's actually shocking how some of us would talk about ourselves and our failures or our struggles, right? So this is showing very positive effects. Humility, that's why we're going to land on that tomorrow. Healthy forms of humility, not oppressive forms of humility, are part of actually knowing our limitations and having constructive responses to our human limitations. Cultural humility, the kind of openness to cultural differences, willingness to learn about others, is protective against this stuff. We'll talk about why that is. Work-family boundaries, really important one. Differentiation of self. How many of you have been exposed to differentiation of self as a construct? We'll spend some time on that. The earlier Bowenian versions of that were interesting. Maybe you got some of that in seminary. There's kind of new, more culturally diverse, relationally robust versions. We have probably 30 studies from our lab showing differentiation of self is positively related to various spiritual and mental health outcomes in this realm. So this is like one of the bread and butter areas that I try to work on with folks. It's associated with all kinds of good spiritual, intercultural, psychological factors, because it gets into emotion regulation, relational maturity, having a clear sense of self-identity. Okay, so there's things that we can work on. Let's talk about some of the more serious risks, just to sit with what's really hard for some people, right? These are not the everyday difficulties of faith leadership, but these are examples from our data with faith leaders about the kind of situations that they are describing as related to trauma symptoms. So, congregant suicides, physical assault or threatened assault as a faith leader. I was doing a talk in a city a while back on narcissism and humility, and there was a faith leader who asked if they could follow up with me and ask a few questions. It's a hard story. She described that she had recently been physically assaulted by her senior pastor over a conflict at work, and her question was, she wondered if I thought she should go to therapy. She had a PhD. She was on a university faculty. She wasn't quite sure if that merited going and getting therapy. She also had a fairly strong view of the need to immediately forgive, which this senior pastor sounded like he was manipulating. So we had a conversation about a bit more of a process-oriented understanding of forgiveness over time, right? So an extreme example, verbal and emotional abuse by congregants or supervisors, sexual assault, sexual harassment by congregants, being stalked, criticism from a congregation for getting fertility treatments, that's a quote on the next slide. Presiding over a funeral per week in some stretches, especially during the pandemic. Threats of violence for social justice activities, denominational threats for social justice commitments or identities, caring for congregants with severe mental illness on a chronic basis, caring for congregants' families involved in violence, both victims and perpetrators, some very unsafe situations described, and pastoral visits in high-risk situations. So here's some quotes from the data. The first one is about a series of 9 deaths in the parish, compounded the weight of the grief that led me to feel overwhelmed. During the pandemic and summer of BLM protests, we had significant conflict regarding how to best express our support for racial justice. I was in the middle of the conflict between more liberal and a few more conservative members. I think probably most of you are familiar with those kind of situations. Here's the one I was referencing. A previous church I was at was angry I sought fertility treatment and became pregnant while the church was closed due to COVID. They argued that if I could go to the doctor, I should be holding in-person worship, doing home visits, etc. It's a different kind of one. I have a young couple in my congregation who experienced a death in the family, and I went over to help them with their children while they attended the death. The dad handed me a handgun, stating that they'd had several break-in and enterings during the year living there, and he'd had to use the gun twice. He left it unsecured on the counter with a 3- and 7-year-old in the house. Now, granted, these are pretty extreme ones, but there's a bunch of these in our data, which are obviously very high valence. This isn't about just invalidation from the congregation or mild level struggles. These are actual existential threats, many of them, right? Or overexposure to grief. And I think that the question again is, what do faith leaders, to me it's a fairly simple question. The answers are not simple necessarily, but what do faith leaders need to do this kind of work well when it sometimes involves this kind of stuff? And are folks getting prepared for that? It's so different for me as a psychologist. I like to think of myself, humor me on this, I like to think of myself as sort of like a prophet, where like when I'm working with a couple, I can just say anything, and if they fire me, there's like a waiting list of folks coming in, right? And someone's gonna take that seat, and it actually frees me up, I think, to be pretty effective. That's that sort of disinhibition. I mean, you hopefully trust I don't overuse it too much, but it actually to be able to tell the truth to people and know I can do that because another couple's gonna slide into that seat, right? That's very different in some pastoral settings about being candid, truth-telling, taking on bullies for this reason. That's a big stressor in some settings. Does this level of acuity of some of the stress surprise some of you, or not really?
I actually don't think this is like, you're like, these are extreme, I don't think these are really that extreme.
Let me offer an idea and see what you think about this in terms of trauma-informed care. So I would say this, the ability that any of us have to reframe something horrible as relatively normal, survivable. I learned this early in I was a chaplain in a correctional facility and then worked as a psychologist in some prisons early in my career. And I can still remember some of the prison psychologists sitting around and having the wildest humor about things during lunch that I'd ever heard. You know, squirrels dying and stuff like that. I remember like thinking, wait, I'm not sure this is good. Like, I couldn't kind of put it together, right? But they're like laughing off stuff that's really serious as kind of a coping strategy, right? And we do need those kinds of capacities to cope with trauma. We do. We can't always take in the vulnerability, the horror, the way it impacts us. So I think we do need those strengths. There's some people who are really raw with their trauma, and one of their challenges is they can't not talk about it, right? They go into the wrong settings, and they spill it out, and they don't have those adaptive defenses, right? But I would also say one other principle of sort of trauma psychology would be there do need to be places that I connect with people about how utterly vulnerable, horrible, unacceptable certain things are. And I think that's a sort of dialectic frame on the issues. And that as people are forming the capacity to deal with this stuff, they get better at knowing, wait, this afternoon, do I need to just kind of let the defenses kick in and realize that I'm going to meet up with Joe Davis later and we can talk and we can process, but I'm not going to do it right now? And do I also have the ability to be intentional about seeking out you, Joe, and we're going to do that for each other, right? I'm concerned if people don't have a place to really get into the depths of it and just keep moving along, hoping that it'll metabolize itself. There's no scientific reason to think this stuff just metabolizes itself. We do need some intentional place to do that. And to have people who get it, where we can feel that they get it, or they're trying to understand our experience of it. And we can face the vulnerability, the fear, the horror, and get ourselves regrounded. Does that make sense, or other thoughts about that?
Yeah, I was going to say that the program that I work with Latino community pastors, they don't return every session because of the material.
Let me give a brief example, then I want to do some stuff on systemic trauma before we break. Just as an example that comes to mind, I'm in a clinical consultation group with other couple therapists. I've been with this group of people for 14 years. We meet online once a month. I wouldn't do therapy if I didn't have this kind of a group to process the impact of the work. A very more mature, emotionally and age-wise therapist in that group called me recently and she said, Steve, I just need a few minutes if you've got some time. She said, I'm working with a couple. I love these people. They have a very painful difference over having kids. I don't think they're going to stay together. She said, I don't need any clinical strategies here. This wasn't a consultation around what should I do. She said, it's just heartbreaking to me, though, that this is just a difference, and I'm trying to hold it with them. What a mature response, right? To say, I'm going to reach out. There was no technique or anything like that. It was just, it was getting to her emotionally, and she reached out. I think that's a kind of wise thing that we need to have people that can do that for us, and that we do that for them. Okay, so we're going to say a little bit about the systemic levels of trauma, and then we'll come back to this. You all asked about systemic trauma. I hope it's obvious there's contextual environmental features that create chronic conditions, both fostering trauma for certain individuals and communities, as well as preventing access to some of these healing resources. Right? So I come to this conversation as someone who really holds all of the privilege cards pretty much in every area. And so I've needed to really work to understand the systemic nature of injustice and trauma that creates different conditions for different folks. How many of you are familiar with Resmaa Menakem's work? So I would highly...
He lives in Minneapolis.
I was going to ask you if you know Resmaa, yeah.
I'll talk about him later too. So
Yeah,
we're on the same way. We're on the same
cool,
way.
cool. Well, highlight Resmaa's book. Tell these folks
My
what...
Grandmother's Hands is a beautiful book. It's actually one of my favorite books, literally. I recommend it to everybody. When he first came out with it, I bought hundreds of copies and people at my workshops and stuff. But yeah, he talks about healing from racialized trauma and how like pretty much anybody who lives in the United States of America has some level of trauma that they carry in their bodies. It's going to be different levels because of our histories and our ancestry.
Resmaa's a therapist. We actually got some training together from the same people early in our careers. Brilliant therapist who has brought his trauma therapy skills, which were honed in the military in Afghanistan and places like that, into racial trauma work. It's a brilliant book. As Joe Davis said, Resmaa's argument is that racialized trauma lives in the bodies of all of us in different ways. And we need embodied approaches to deal with it. So the book is chock full of different exercises, practices. He's a real stickler on don't just read this for cognitive understanding, keep doing it. He also is brilliant about that some of what we need to deal with stress and trauma is to learn to downregulate, quiet ourselves, to calm our bodies. But we also need movement. And so he also highlights active ways to move stress cortisol through our bodies. And again, I love that dialectical approach that we need to develop practices that help us to calm and also to move and work it through, right? Obviously, there's intergenerational, I think it's obvious, there's intergenerational effects of trauma. I've seen this as a family therapist in ways that were shocking to me early in my career. I would hear a young adult describe something in their family and how upset their parents were about it. And so I can still remember this client. She was diagnosed with a learning disability, and it had just influenced her whole life. She was a young adult. And she's telling me what a huge deal this was in her family, and her mom was so upset. She brings her mom into a session, and then we had a follow-up session. In the session when the daughter's not even there, the mom starts describing this, and I can just see the waves of trauma impact in the mom's face, describing something from 20 years ago. And if you've never had the experience of watching the different parts of a family system and putting together how these impacts, which are heavily loaded towards shame, towards fear, and then to dissociation, it's very powerful. So again, as we've been talking about the history of those of us in these leadership positions, I think it highlights why we need to understand both our personal, family, cultural, national history, and the trajectory of influences that move into us, into our bodies and our psyches. And again, I'm struck that how much progress we can make with wise approaches to this. I worked with I'll give you one example and then we'll go to break, a fairly young therapist years ago who had a very difficult family of origin background, but she was working as a licensed therapist in kind of a crisis center. And she really had not processed a lot of the trauma from her background, but she was smart, seemed like a really good therapist, but it was starting to come. About a year into therapy, she went to a continuing education workshop on trauma. And it was sort of like her defenses had relaxed to the point that it was time to deal with this stuff. And this is kind of a shocking example. Licensed therapist in the Boston area. She got in her car to go home from the workshop, and she couldn't remember where she lived. She drove around the perimeter of Boston on the interstates for 3 hours. And she could not remember where she lived. She had a graduate degree, a clinical license, right? And in some ways, that was the beginning of important healing. That was a super dissociative response to trauma that was really activated. And thank God she remembered to call her husband after 3 hours of driving around. And he came and found her. And she got more deep into the depths. I often think of it as using a kind of a water metaphor, that you do have to go down beneath the water line and go into the depths. And you need some people who will swim down there with you. It was important that her husband, who is a very positive-minded person, would have probably read a lot of positive psychology, didn't know how to swim into the deep. He had to learn to swim into the deep with her, so she wasn't alone in that. And she came through that and grew and healed and went on to get a doctorate and is a leader in the field at this point. But that example of when the stuff really comes online, any of us could be driving around and not remember where home is. That's when the trauma is really, really activating us. And it's important to find the right relationships and the right systems that will provide a dwelling place. This will be some of the relational spirituality stuff. A safe dwelling place, not so safe that we don't deal with anything difficult, because that's a dialectic too, but a safe enough dwelling place to get connected and to have people that'll help us process the existential and spiritual depths and psychological depths of that kind of suffering. Okay, we need a break. Let's take, where are we at? Let's take 15. So what's the question?
Well, I was going to ask if you're familiar with Dan Allender's work.
Yeah.
You follow that with the theology, psychology.
Yeah. I've met Dan. Yeah. Did you get trained with this stuff?
I did.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
okay.
A lot of this is,
Yeah, I had a lot of Dan Allender influence early in my career. Yeah.
Where, in Ohio, Oklahoma?
No, I'm not directly. I just went to a lot of the seminars and stuff, and yeah, and then got some interaction with him. And so he's involved in the ATS trauma and spirituality thing that I'll mention here too. That is,
Rachel Evans?
no, she's not. I don't think she's involved, but he's.
Sorry, not Rachel Evans. She said R.I.P. But with
But she could still be like somehow.
just curious. With who's the one who the lawyer for Larry Nassar's case? She's doing a lot of that work. Rachel Denhollinger.
Okay, so let me hit just a couple things briefly, and then we'll settle into Chrysalis. There's a little comment here, too, about the importance of integrating diversity, sensitivity, intercultural competence, cultural humility, whichever constructs you want to use to describe the ability to relate well and effectively across differences, is in our relational spirituality work very highly empirically associated with spiritual maturity. So we're really talking about relational capacities to be curious, to take the perspective of others, to know oneself, and to relate well across differences. And our group has published 12 or 15 studies on this stuff with Christian seminary students or faith leaders, mostly in evangelical contexts, which are a little bit more conservative, and yet you still see that these capacities to relate effectively across differences are just part of good, healthy Christian spiritual formation. And they're necessary, especially for trauma sensitivity. You need folks who are open to people's experience, who have perspective taking, who can respect boundaries and differences. So I really like to link intercultural competence, cultural humility, spiritual formation, emotional, psychological development. We need to weave all these together, not just for leaders, but just for Christian folks in general.
So did I read correctly? I want to make sure I get this right, because I think what you said is really important and powerful. Wow, like, so the ability to be informed, I don't know what the language is here, but to be more, to have practice in cultural competency and whatever impacts spiritual maturity.
I'm saying that it's the same stuff. Like, again, we've published a bunch of studies on this showing that in general in the Christian community, people who care about sexism, who care about racism and working against that, what you find is associations with other relational virtues like humility and compassion and spiritual maturity, even over and above impression management effects. There's a research layer to this I could unpack that you may not need. But you know, some of this stuff's gotten so polarized, and you want to talk about racism, and people, oh, this is leftist politics. Well, actually, I'm saying we've got a body of evidence with seminary students and faith leaders that suggests, no, this is part of spiritual maturity, that you need to be concerned about injustice. You need to be able to take the perspective of others. Humility correlates with all this stuff. Compassion does too. And weave these things together, right? It's going to be hard to do trauma-sensitive ministry if the leader doesn't really care about people's suffering or has rigid, narcissistic views of those things, right? And if they also lack self-awareness of their own sociocultural background, gender identity, sexual orientation, you know, if that stuff, if I'm oblivious to that, that's going to limit my ability to relate effectively to people who've had all kinds of different experiences, right? I mean, some of my most important capacities as a therapist are really around that whole set of issues. And Joe Davis and I were talking about last night that when I was doing DEI training years ago in the Twin Cities, this is a good anecdote to make my point, we had all the principals in a school district in our intercultural competence training. We put them in small groups. They got an assessment. They were supposed to work on their intercultural competence. A white principal comes up to me one day and she says, you know what? I don't know if I'm making any progress in intercultural competence, but my marriage is going better. Yeah, it's the same stuff. It's how you relate respectively amidst differences, and manage emotional reactions to things, and be candid about points of difference, right? And in the absence of those relational capacities, it's hard to do relationships, like couple relationships or family relationships. I mean, I've got two emerging adults who challenge my worldview on things on a regular basis, right? It's an intercultural exercise for me to relate to my 23 and 20-year-old, right? So I need it there. I need it to do the kind of helping work that I do. I need it to work with a variety of students. And I think that these are spiritual formation practices. That it's not like just a behavior you can develop. It comes out of development. Yeah, Gary.
Just a supportive quote from the person I like to quote the most, Dallas Willard, who said that the only way to separate the aspects of the person, including the social dimension, are with the chapter titles of the book.
Right. Yeah, it's all woven in there together. Right. Okay. You know, our literature review that Kristen led, that you all have, showed that when it comes to risk factors for burnout and trauma among faith leaders, you've got individual level factors that came up, personal background, my personality. You have relational dynamics, and you have systemic factors. And so we need that sort of multidimensional frame about these issues. We also need to give good attention to flourishing, which I know a number of you are. Well-being and flourishing are not the same thing as the absence of trauma and burnout. In fact, actually, we like to argue in our Peel project that Just preventing burnout or vicarious trauma is a low bar, right? Like, what if we actually could get faith leaders having high levels of holistic well-being and thriving, right? Same with therapists and chaplains. I think that's where the conversation needs to move. So that's this point number one. We need to tune into these several dimensions that are sometimes obscured by a self-care focus. You'll hear a little bit later that one of the angles that we're playing with our project is that we need to move beyond self-care. Folks on my team, like Laura Kaptari, she put that in the title of a symposium at the American Psychological Association convention, Beyond Self-Care. And the ballroom was packed with people sitting on the floor. So we're doing our fall conference on that. You've got information on your slides about it, which is free thanks to the Peel Foundation. We're not against self-care. I practice self-care. I think that's important. But the rhetoric around leaders and self-care is problematic, in our opinion. It's highly individualistic, it's Eurocentric, it sort of blames the individual for whatever happens, rather than looking at the relational systemic context as important things. Like, I'm responsible for myself. I take responsibility for that. By the way, I turned down an offer to do something this morning that I got an email. Is there any validation here for that? Right? I got to be responsible about that kind of stuff. But there's also these existential levels that I think are underplayed. We'll come back to that. There's these relational systemic levels. And the focus just on self-care doesn't deal with the whole nature of systemic factors that can get into, again, sexism, racism, various things.
Don't you think that language around self-care has been really cheapened?
I do. I think that I think it doesn't get at most of what we've been talking about this morning. It doesn't get at me taking an honest look at my own rescuer motivations, right, that come from my family of origin. It doesn't require me to look at the cultural context. It doesn't require me to look at the relational dynamics that are playing out in my life. Now, I went for a walk this morning too. I think it's good to do some behaviors, right, that are healthy, but I think self-care sort of cheapens it. And I think that there's a growing, we also did a workshop at APA this year that was maxed out. I think there's a growing desire that I see among leaders to say, wait, we need a different paradigm for this, a more relational, systemic, existential, spiritual paradigm than just self-care. Even the phrase itself is a little difficult. So let me get to this and then Danielle, this is for your comment earlier. There was a really fun study by Bunderson and Thompson back in 2009 about the double-edged sword of a sense of calling to our work. They did a study with zookeepers. See the picture on the bottom, right? With zookeepers. And it was really interesting that they found that almost everybody who works in zoos considers that work incredibly meaningful and important and feels almost a sense of calling to it, which is why they found such a high level of them being willing to sacrificing pay, personal time, and overworking as a moral duty, right? It's a kind of an interesting way into considering how our sense of calling to our work. I love my work, actually. I find my work incredibly meaningful to the point that if I'm not careful, I would just do it all the time, right? And I think that's an important issue in the mix here, is the strength for most of us who are faith leaders or therapists or in the helping professions of our sense of the meaning of our work is got some risks to it. Does that make sense? Or let me see if there's comments about that. And the existential dimensions of our work, this is something that we also feel strongly about, that this runs beneath a sort of emotional, psychological. I mean, how many of you have ever worked on developing a ministry or a program that a church that you thought did something really significant, and then some systemic forces came along and just tore it down. I won't ask for a show of hands. That takes you into the existential level if you really sit with that, right? That's not captured by stress. I don't think stress does justice to that. That takes us into Job, Ecclesiastes territory of, and then if we all know that we're working at stuff even now, that could happen to again, I think that level of awareness, connection, processing is also underrated. And the seemingly absurd experiences that come. Writing about a case example of a chaplain. I love this story. I mean, it's such a painful story, but you all will get it. This chaplain in an urban hospital who was overworked, under-resourced. They cut her continuing education budget. They were pulling her every different direction. And one of the hospital administrators sends an email and says, in response to her email, that we're out of office supplies in the department. She literally couldn't find a pen to write with. And the hospital administrator sends back this cold email. Once the supply closet is completely empty, then we will order more office supplies. And this chaplain, she gave me permission to tell this story. I'm masking some things. She went back to the supply closet because she thought it was empty, and she found a box of red pens. And have you ever been in this kind of place, existentially? A box of red pens. And the immediate implication, when you're stressed and on the edges, I'm going to have to use all of these red pens before I can get any other pens, right? It felt absurd. So she did the rational thing, which was she took the box of red pens and got in the elevator and went down behind the hospital to the dumpster and threw the damn box of red pens in the dumpster. Right? So that's a red, we call that on our team, we call that a red pen moment. Have you ever had a red pen moment? Where the absurdity of the converging stressors take you down to this existential level that raises the question, is this all a joke? Is there any meaning in this? That's an important level to meet people in, right? Thoughts about that? Yeah, thank you for that example. There's a lot of bypassed grief and dealing with existential stuff that keeps traumatic experience in play. And sometimes there's these absurd red pen symbols of it that are significant because they're a tipping point that references something deeper. But can we get in our leadership teams, in our communities, to the processing the deeper stuff? How many churches are divided over things like red pens, My colleague, Jonathan Vanderbeck from our team, who's doing a lot of consultation with small mainline Protestant churches in the Northeast that are dying. And, 50 people, 30, 20 people. And he will note the amazingly tenacious conflicts they can have in those churches over something like red pens, because it's so hard to just process the grief that this may not continue. So grief is a really interesting, powerful existential force. We don't really cheat it. We can avoid it if we want to. We can be nasty to people over it, but it's going to have its way. We found, not surprisingly perhaps, during the pandemic, we were doing this national seminary student research longitudinal study at 18 seminaries, tracked patterns of dealing with burnout among students during the pandemic. a resilient trajectory of students encountering adversity and still growing over time was associated with a sense of transformation. That's a big word. But really what it meant is they found their way into relational spaces. They could process complex emotions. And that was basically the differential factor between whether students who were at risk of high levels of burnout had a rebound and then a resilient trajectory versus worsening. Again, that part doesn't sound like rocket science, does it? Healthy relational spaces to process complex emotions. But the data showed that was the differential factor. Some students had that, some students didn't. And it was predictive. We've talked about self-compassion. There's some resources for you as a protective factor. In our data with faith leaders, Elise Cho is running these analyses. Differentiation, 2 big protective factors. I tried to get all my seminary students to read Friedman's Generation to Generation. How many of you have read Friedman? And this is crucial kind of stuff. We probably need a contemporary version of it. We've got data, Sarah Crabtree from our team is looking at, we've got data on spouses and partners of faith leaders. You probably won't be surprised. This is Sarah's complex model showing reciprocal effects of burnout and flourishing. It flows both ways around work and family dynamics. When faith leaders find ways to practice boundaries about the work influence, it goes better for their marriage. When they don't, it flows back the other way. So that's an important set of issues. Let me come back to the trauma-informed pastoral care principles. There's some more resources for you. Let me do the chrysalis thing. So this is what's coming out of our Peel project. What are we doing for time? During the pandemic, our institute got some money early in the pandemic from the Luce Foundation to throw together some support groups for chaplains who were facing incredible loss and death, right? And so we got our clinical staff to lead short-term Zoom-based support groups, and we were struck at how effective those were. You know, would connecting with a few other chaplains online in a Zoom group with people you don't know be that helpful? We threw some research around it. We found it was tremendously helpful. Some of these folks didn't have other people to talk to who would get it, who understood what it was like. Many of them told us they didn't have time to drive across town to meet with some other people. I mean, on the one hand, you could think the Zoom-based group is not as great as live, but we found that it actually increased access to some connection. So we found those worked really well. And here's the backstory. I got a call one day from my dean who said, the Peel Family Foundation might like to talk to somebody on our faculty who does like positive psychology stuff. Would you want to talk to them about a possible grant? And I said, sure. When? And she said, well, it's in 15 minutes. So I was working from home. I put on a button-down shirt, and 15 minutes later, I was making a pitch about a project, because this is the one chance. And I saw what was happening for these groups with chaplains, and I realized the situation is even more serious for faith leaders, clergy, and we also need it for therapists. So I pitched the idea, what if we could develop and test in state-of-the-art research a formation-based online group program for each of these groups, and it would be the first study of its kind, really, to try to test the effect of that. And the Peel said, let's go for it. So, and then my research team required that we turn it into a randomized controlled trial, which is extremely challenging to do. The most rigorous science. I resisted that for a while because I was gonna let's just get the study done, They said, no, people aren't gonna take it seriously unless we do the most rigorous test. So what we ended up deciding to do was to develop 2 versions, a group version, which we extended to 8 weeks. We'd had an earlier version with the chaplains. And then a fully online individual self-reflection version. We put grounding exercises, our reflection questions, ask folks to do some expressive writing, wrap up and expose them to some of the content of our model, and wrap up the sessions with a poem, which is kind of parallels the group process. I'll be candid with you. They give me a hard time because at first I was calling the individual thing the shitty condition. They like to remind me of that. Because I was really invested in the group condition and still am. But we developed this individual one, and then it sort of dawned on me, I was a little slow to realize this, that like this was a good thing because not everybody would be able to do the groups anyway. And what if we were able to develop 2 different formats that could empirically show reduction of burnout, vicarious trauma, and possibly facilitate well-being in all 3 of these groups. This has been a mammoth undertaking for our institute. I probably wouldn't have gotten permission to do it if I had realized and everybody else had realized what we were biting off. We are a community mental health center that does psychotherapy. And this is not psychotherapy. This is something else. You know, people have a hard time kind of understanding what is this thing exactly? It's not supervision, it's not pure consultation, it's not psychotherapy. We call it formation. I know that like that doesn't answer all the questions, but here's the idea. Let's talk about the group condition for a minute. The idea is you get a chance to meet with other clergy, therapists, or chaplains. We have the groups by vocation. For this 8-week group, led by 2 clinicians, to connect around what the work stress is, how it's impacting you, to take a look at this model I'll show you about potential strengths to draw upon, and to process that and try to get your head above water to figure out what steps you might be able to take. We have found that the relational experience in well-facilitated groups is significant. We found again, the program's free, given the Peel Grant. So there's no cost. That increases access. For psychotherapists, there's stuff like this that you can do online for like $1,200, right? So for some people, they don't have other places to do this kind of stuff. So we called it Chrysalis. The team came up with this acronym, catalyzing helping professionals' resilience, vitality, spirituality, authentic living, and inner strength. With the chrysalis being a kind of a metaphor too, of a kind of incubating crucible of transformation, that's what you're entering into, right? So I'll skip over some of this, you can come back to it. This fits our paradigm shift from self-care to formation. So that's part of the conversation in both the individual and group condition is this whole set of issues. We, people can get in a group and just grouse about the system they work in. That's not necessarily transformative. But we do find that people are helped by getting a very real conversation to kind of get their bearings about what is going on here, what am I up against, what's the system pulling from me, why am I giving into it, and we think that's constructive to get a place to do that, right? So here's kind of the main things that we're aiming to foster. Processing, metabolizing is a word we like to use, the impacts of companioning with others amidst suffering and trauma. Develop spiritually embedded strengths and virtues, I'll come back to, in order to build resilience. Reflect on intersectional identities, life experiences, and core values and how these inform what is needed personally. And interrogate and resist personal, relational, and systemic pressures that are counter to well-being while working towards systemic change. So those are the goals of the program. one feature that is part of the model is we're kind of virtue formation theorists on our team, that we think virtues are constructive strengths that are not really microwavable, but that can, like humility, self-compassion, commitment to justice. These are really virtue constructs that have to be formed holistically, right? And they can be helpful to us in particular contexts, but I have to learn how to apply them in a particular context. It doesn't help so much to just try to be humble everywhere, right? That's not really what virtue traditions have taught, that you need the wisdom of how to apply them in a particular situation. We also realize that in this, sort of short-term intervention, we aren't going to try to tell people what strengths they need to exercise in their particular context. We want to invite people into some reflection about themselves, their context, and the challenges, and present a kind of menu of different clusters of strengths that might be helpful. So this is the model that we hold up, that there's 5 different dimensions. There are relational capacities that involve sort of connecting with others and seeing oneself in the context of other people and relationships. Some people might be drifting from that and need to think if there's a way they can shore that up, build that up. There's vitalizing capacities, which is a way of trying to get energized, to enjoy things, to have some humor. I did a little intervention with myself about a year ago where I was wanting to feel a little vitalized, and we had a bunch of old files in the staff room that no one was using. So I started putting them in my colleagues' mailboxes just to see how long it would take for people to notice that there's these random files nobody needed, right? I found that fun. It was kind of vitalizing, right? Injected a little humor. My colleagues started doing it back to me, and pretty soon the workday's kind of fun because you're figuring out how to prank someone, right, in your same building. And that's not the only way to vitalize, but I got a couple weeks of energy out of it. Orienting capacities, like wisdom, coming back to what are my key priorities and values? What am I really trying to do in this work? Sometimes when feeling overwhelmed with work or a dysfunctional system, it can be really helpful to wait. What am I about? What am I trying to do here? That's kind of an aspect of differentiation as well. Let me get in touch with what I'm about here. Agentic capacities. This would include assertiveness, speaking out for justice, pushing back against the system, right? There's times where this might be really necessary. There's times where a system will punish this, so it takes some wisdom to kind of sort out, is this the wise thing to do? And processing capacities, which is grief. It's processing the emotional impact of things. A while back, I'm trying to apply this to myself, of course, and I work in different units of our university, and I was realizing I was feeling stressed about a couple different things. I laid this out, and I thought, you know what's really interesting? In one department I work in, I need to just do some of that grief processing because the system is not looking like it's going to change in the way I would want, and I need to come to terms with that. And in the other department, I needed to get a little more agentic and be a little more assertive about some stuff. And it was kind of interesting how it took some reflection to realize I needed to exercise different strengths in different parts of my job. And that didn't become apparent to me until I took some time to do that. So in our program, whether in the individual condition or the group condition, that's the kind of perspective we're trying to invite people into, is getting a chance to reflect on that process with some others. So let me just go through a couple things and then we'll have plenty of time. So as I said, we're finding, actually let me drop down to this one. In the first 15 months, we're doing these in seasonally, so 4 rounds a year, doing both group and individual conditions. In the first 15 months, we had 188. We use helping professionals to refer to therapists, clergy, or chaplains. 188 enrolled and completed the program. We're screening, we're doing screenings of anyone who applies to make sure that this is the right fit. This doesn't take the place of therapy. We occasionally have folks who this may not be the time for them to do this. They really need more intensive psychotherapy. We also have, it's kind of interesting, clergy often come to the screenings and they say, well, I can't commit to 8 weeks of being available at that group time condition. We rarely get that from chaplains or therapists. But in the screening, people find out, look, my life is actually not conducive to even doing this, which is also kind of sobering to see. Both formats, my team will say, Steve, the shitty conditions working, that both formats are reducing burnout and trauma symptoms. So far, the group format's showing a little bit extra bump on increased well-being. The individual format is actually showing increased exercising of virtues and sense of meaning in work. So we might get, it's too early to form final conclusions. In the article I sent you, we published the findings from the first 2 rounds, but we're doing this for 5 years. So it's a big undertaking. Here's what we're finding so far. Here's some examples from the qualitative data of participants about what they're finding helpful. In the area of relational capacities, I'm accepting of the fact that I'm not God. There's many things that I don't and will never know. And I continue to process humility and trying to have an accurate view of myself and my role. Orienting capacities, recognizing that what is important to me is not negated by the desires, wants, expectations of the parish. I've rededicated my internal compass to the importance and value of the work, but also to myself as a worker, someone worthy of compassion. Processing capacities, more able to sit in a space of suffering with others without compulsion to problem solve. Right? That's kind of the relational space. You can imagine, I assume, if you get a group of therapists together in a group and just get them start talking, they start trying to do therapy on each other, right? And the same with the faith. So you need the leaders to kind of help people get into what the space is. And that's, in the first week or two, a lot of where the action's at. And understandably, many of the folks who come to this are like, wait, what is this? Is this a consultation group with each other? No. It's not therapy? No. So it's a little ambiguous what it is, but you want people to settle into, it's a space to process what the work is feeling like to you and what you may need to do. Vitalizing and agentic capacities, you can probably imagine how this plays out. Let me hear your questions, your thoughts about this, and your thoughts about other kinds of interventions that you are doing or could do that would speak to these needs. We put this model in the article I sent out in the pilot study of our chrysalis intervention has this figure in it. So it's the Laura Captaria study. So
you all created that, so you didn't borrow it from.
we created that, yeah.
I'm
Yep,
incredibly curious if we could, like 8 weeks is quick.
I know.
And so I'm like, can we all, literally, I'm like looking at your website, can I go through the screening? Like, can we go through, because that, to me, the depth of what you're able to accomplish in 8 weeks is incredibly, I'm curious about how that is happening so quickly in such a diverse online.
Yeah, and we're humble about, we don't assume that, that's like, we mostly at our clinic do long-term therapy. So I'm by nature a long-term therapist. I'm not a quick intervention guy. But we knew that it would be pretty hard to get people to commit to something longer than 8 weeks. And we really think of it as we're trying to get people oriented to a different way of being about their work. And groups can continue on their own. I mean, we can't afford to have we have licensed and training fellow clinical staff, 2 of them stewarding these groups. So, we're turning people loose to keep it out. And we know that really this is like just almost more like a checkup and getting oriented to some new ways of being. So we're glad that it's working, but it isn't all the work. It's like yeah.
But if you front-ended something like this in a program that you're developing and had an 8, like as
Yeah,
a way of
exactly. That's how we're thinking about it.
and then really becoming
Right.
like together, I'm entering into something.
And we're intrigued by the two intervention, that there's a way that people could continue to some work on their own. And there's a variety of ways you could organize this, but I think the integration of attention to these work stressors like we've been talking about this morning, that's sort of baked in. The invitation to honest conversation about that, enough relational stewarding that, we have intern therapists that we pair with a senior person, but they're sometimes up against, a group of relatively narcissistic folks with a lot of experience. It's not like a walk in the park. You all can imagine if, you're going into this group and you want to get into this kind of healthy conversation, but you've got, 3 of the 6 pastors are pretty narcissistic, privileged white men who are dominating. You got to be pretty assertive about how you move the space to get it into the right conversations, right? So that takes a certain skill set and intentionality to be able to do that. We're finding that there's a couple different groups. There's folks who've had some sort of healthy connection with peers in the past, but it's drifted away for various reasons. We also realize that it's a unique thing in that you're connecting with people outside of your particular work system. And we think that's both a strength and there's a limitation to it. It's great for a pastoral leadership team to be able to work on this stuff together, but you provide a unique opportunity for some people to be able to come in and say what they need to say without their boss in the room or, outside their system. And there are some people who say they just haven't had this. It's not that they just got sidetracked from it. And we've had people that are doing pretty well, but they're the kind of folks who are always looking to grow and find something else that they can make use of. So there's probably 3 different groups.
I feel like I'm trying to force fit something.
Yeah, I think one of the unique things about this is we're working out of a kind of a virtue ethics framework or virtue formation, that these are sets of strengths that probably our pushback against that would be, can you really put spiritual over here and physical? I realize there's a heuristic value to doing that, but we're probably a little less drawn to just doing that and more getting at these, what we think are unique clusters of virtues that involve ways of handling oneself in the world. And it's not like you can do any of these all of the time. That's what we think is also kind of complex is, I had a young social worker recently I was working with in therapy who was like, I'm so pissed about, our organization's lack of attention to sexism and transphobia and all this. And I made an appointment with the CEO and I'm going to let him have it, And I so valued her courage and agency and felt she also needed a space to talk about whether she was prepared for the fallout that was likely to happen since I knew the organization and had a pretty good idea that there wasn't any way in hell and so I think to have a space where you can figure out what do I do with this pull, which is a virtue in some contexts, but could get me fired. Here, maybe I should get fired if I'm ready for that. But people need a space to sort out what's the wise move in this context that I'm actually called to enact. And maybe it's not actually the set of virtues that come most naturally to me. Maybe it's something I haven't really developed before. We have some highly agentic people in these groups who have never really processed grief before or never come to terms with the limits, or vice versa, who could use a little more assertiveness that they're inhibited about. So I think it's the virtue cluster stuff that we're really drawn to. That's probably a limitation that, it could be that some people might do better in the self-directed thing that's got, more visual stuff and isn't so relational. Like I'm big on the relational angle, but it could be that some people would do better in the self-directed thing. Right now we're trying to compare the two and see what the relative efficacy is of each one of them. So.
Have you seen anyone, or is it even an option, to move from self-directed and then into the relational model?
Not right now. While we're doing the trial, you're randomly assigned.
Okay.
That's the randomized controlled part, yeah. So hopefully over time we'll have 2 good interventions and we can use them more flexibly and, but right now you're doing one or the other because we're really trying to test the efficacy. Keeping track of reasons that it doesn't work for, and that's another limitation, is that doing this kind of research, we don't have a lot of degrees of freedom about that sort of thing and actually be able to test the effects. And there's other limitations, like we're able to do 4 groups around, and we have times where those particular times people can't commit to, So we're trying to both offer daytime and evening groups, but I'm hoping to actually move the needle on policy and be able to go to decision makers and say, we think that interventions like this work, and then invite people to develop other versions of it. That will be a phase where we can have greater flexibility to in implementation. So that's a limitation of, We're hoping that the free service, increases access, but there's systemic things that just you can't totally get around, and you're raising good points about that.
Well, actually, I think, I hope that your study names that, right? If people can see and say, like our study found that these people aren't accessible, so we can see and know that.
Yeah.
It helps us to know where that support's needed more.
Right, exactly, yeah. Yeah, we're keeping track of demographics and reasons that people can't do it. And as I said, faith leaders sometimes cannot commit either to that sort of schedule. It's a ecumenical program. So for the clergy conditions, it's not religiously matched. So for some people, they wouldn't choose to do that.
Is there something that's coming out of that?
Great question. Let me mention just a couple of things quickly. We're doing research with 2 Jewish seminaries. Also, this is aside from this project, where Shabbat, Sabbath, is a key spiritual practice. And we're doing research with seminary students at these 2 Jewish seminaries. One's a progressive, pluralistic Jewish seminary. The other one is an Orthodox Jewish seminary in New York City that is all women, which is really interesting. Orthodox Jewish seminary, all women, Yeshivat Maharat. And in both of those systems, it's a spiritual ritual. This like one of the core things. Like it's not like down the list. So that's been really interesting and good learning for me to see how central the rhythms of life in those traditions are. The calendar, all of that. We also did a project that was separate from this at an urban seminary in the U.S. that we did a humility intervention. We're going to talk about humility and narcissism tomorrow. We did a humility formation intervention study where we tested a humility formation program. And framing it in some of the ways we're talking about, but also different. And what was interesting is Sabbath rest became one of the key themes from the students at this seminary. It was a lot of people who are actually non-traditional students, probably the most ethnically diverse seminary in the country. And many of those students, when they got to what were the formation practices around humility they were going to do, Sabbath rest emerged as the key practice, as an exercise in humility, which was really interesting. And that seminary decided, hey, this is one of the big things that we need to emphasize, not specifically for self-care as the theme, but as humility, knowing my limitations. So we see folks in this group who decide that's what I need to be more boundaried about getting rest. And I for the past 6 years was working with a group in Norway on a PhD program in religion and social science over there. And they would take Scandinavian doctoral students down to the island of Lesbos in Greece for study seminar. And this was one of my favorite experiences in academia. We would meet in the morning to have some lectures, and then the afternoon was just to yourself. And you could go down to the beach, or you could go for a hike. The whole afternoon was off. And then we'd come back to do a couple sessions at like 4 and 5, and then eat dinner out on the patio and drink wine. That's education to me. And it actually worked better than the sort of hard driving, we go from 9 until 9. I felt like there was more formation happening in the students, more learning. The relational dynamics were part of it, right? And that's space. So I'm glad that we get space this afternoon to, do what we need to do. Well, this has been a great conversation, you all. Thank you so much. As I said, tomorrow we'll do humility and narcissism and relational spirituality, but feel free to keep raising what you want to try to get to that's going to be most helpful to the work you're trying to do.